I wonder how God's heart feels like every Sunday is kind of like Father's Day to him. I mean, can you imagine dads, like your kids running into your room and saying, Dad, you are like wonderful to us. Last night, my son Jeremy came over to wish me an early happy Father's Day because he's going to Colorado to see friends and work out there. But he didn't want me to feel abandoned on Father's Day. So he texted me that he'd found a food truck at Knoll and I-35, and he wanted to bring me some of their street tacos. So he brings them over and says, Happy Father's Day, Dad. And I'm like, wow, this is altogether wonderful. and then he said, I haven't tried those before. You want to split them? So I'm like, yes, I do. Today is Father's Day, and my topic is how not to be a fearful dad. My dad was pretty handy. He's been gone for 12 years now, 11 years. He died on September 11th, 2011. So 10 years after the one that we all know by heart. But he remodeled nearly every house we ever lived in, even if he didn't own them, because he was a pastor too, and sometimes we lived in parsonages, and so he'd ask the church council, hey, you mind if I finish the basement and build out some of the stuff in the back? And they're like, okay. So it was a great way that he processed stress. And then when Laura and I bought our first house in the Chicago suburbs, he helped me finish the basement, or I should say I helped him finish the basement. From the studs and, shooting the nail guns into the cement. And so the studs, the circuits, the drywall ceiling. I learned a lot from him, and some things we learned together. One of the things we discovered early on is that it's worth paying somebody to tape and mud your sheetrock. Sounds like there's some remodelers who can agree with that. One of the unintended things, however, that he taught me was to be afraid of spiders. He always backed up when he saw one, regardless of how harmless, innocuous, or small it was, and he shouted out loud if he was surprised by one. Now, he was strategic and he had wisdom, right? So if he was going to stick his hand in a dark place that he hadn't been in before, we were going underneath to sheetrock or put insulation somewhere, he'd always have long sleeves and his leather gloves on, and I followed suit. But if he ever ran or was surprised by one, he would, Wah! I would say screech, but that doesn't seem like an honorable thing to say about your late father, but it's pretty close. He was cautious about the truly poisonous ones, but he was actually afraid of all spiders. And I marveled that he could jump back with a near shriek when he saw an insect with 8 legs, but he would just flick off. Not that flick off. he would flick off his arm if he saw a bug with 6 legs. So, of course, over time I picked that up. And I think he noticed sometime in Brown Elementary School, maybe on a camping trip or a hike, that I was very afraid of spiders. And I think he started to feel guilty. Now, if you're a regular here at Caw Prairie, you can imagine that we take stewardship very seriously, not just the finances, but the building and the property. So I will help trap just about anything here at Caw Prairie. And because there's been some construction recently, right, with Casey's going up, there have been some surprising animals in here. We've had mice, no longer because we get them all under control, but there's been mice. I remember getting a bat out of here. I remember shooing out a snake. So I'll help with everything except for spiders. And for that, of course, you and I know who we would turn to, Pastor Chris.
I'm still trying. There was a snake in here?
It was before your time, maybe. I'm being like a dad. Oh, that one time was this big. Okay, it was this big, and it was a few years ago. No, it's really Carissa that gets the spiders. So sometime in elementary school, my dad sat me down, and he had a conversation with me about my fears. He said, in rough terms, he said, I think I've been afraid of spiders all my life. I don't know how I got it, It was probably something, I don't even remember what the details were. He said he didn't know where he got the fear. And he said, and he was very intentional, he said, spiders, for the most part, are not at all dangerous, and a lot of times they're super helpful. They eat the bugs that we don't want on our, on our plants, and they're good all around for eating bad bugs. And he said, but still, I'm still afraid of them, and I'm trying to stop, and I don't want you to be afraid of them. It's just hard to change something you felt for years. And I would say absolutely, it's hard. It's hard to change the things you've thought or behavior patterns you've fallen into for years. Changing the things, though, that make you afraid is probably one of the hardest things. Fear is very contagious. And I'm going to submit to you that it's especially contagious among parents. We all love our children. We want the best for our children. We're even willing to do a lot of scary things to protect our children. That's where the whole mama bear meme and that all comes from, right? But fear can double back to hurt our children. And so, again today, my challenge is to lead us into consider how not to be a fearful dad or mom. But it's their day, moms, and we get very little else going on. I got a street taco, so we're going to keep this the topic. Right? How not to be a fearful dad. So in the first 4 generations of God's people, right, and, in Genesis 12, we go from kind of the prehistory, and then we go to the real history starting with Abraham. And starting with Abraham, we have a series of parents who, at some level, are afraid. So Abraham was scared that God wasn't going to be faithful enough to come through on his promises, to give him and his wife, Sarah, a son. So he took Sarah's kind of nervous, fearful advice, because Sarah was nervous that it wouldn't happen either, and she was nervous that her husband would be mad at her, and so she said, how about you sleep with my servant Hagar? And so he's like, okay. That's another sermon. So it was their fear together that had him impregnate his wife's servant. And then when his wife did get pregnant, when Sarah did get pregnant, and then raised the son, so Hagar's son was older than Sarah's son, and they kind of got picked, and so they kind of picked on each other. They kicked Hagar out of the house with her young son into the desert, and they would have perished there if God hadn't graciously intervened. So that was just like the first part of the first generation. And the second generation was that Rachel was afraid that her son Esau wouldn't get. Rachel was afraid that her son Esau would get a blessing that she wanted for Jacob. Right? These are the 2 twins, and so she and her son Jacob deceived her husband and her other son and stole her other son Esau's blessing, breaking apart the family forever and breaking Esau's and her husband's heart because she was afraid. And then Jacob's uncle Laban, the one that Jacob ran to, I'm telling you these stories fast because I figure you've heard of them, but Jacob's uncle Laban was the one that Jacob ran to, and then he fell in love with Laban's younger daughter, and then asked to marry her, but then he had to work 7 years, and then the morning after the wedding night, ta-da, he finds out that he had slept with and therefore consummated the marriage with the older daughter, and of course that meant he was permanently married to her, and then he agreed to work another 7 years for the daughter that he, quote, really wanted. And all that came from Laban's fear that he'd be stuck with an older daughter that wasn't as winsome or pretty as the younger daughter. All this came from Laban's fear that he wouldn't be able to keep his house in order if he had a spinster daughter grow up under his roof. So he deceived and lied to Jacob. And then when Jacob was old and gray, 10 of his 12 sons were held hostage in Egypt by their 11th son, who had the Technicolor Dreamcoat. What was the name? Joseph. All right, just check and make sure you're with me. He'd risen to the rank of prime minister, and so Joseph then lied to his 10 brothers that had come there seeking food during a famine. He deceived them as he weighed how much to pay them back for the sneakery that they'd given him when they left him in a dry well to die. And then finally, Jacob, also Joseph's father, was scared to let his last and favorite remaining son, Benjamin, go to Egypt to prove to the prime minister that they didn't know was their brother, that they were telling the truth. When Jacob finally agreed to let Benjamin go, and he went, he finally broke Joseph's resolve to be vindictive on the 10 brothers and prompted him to invite his former family, all these brothers and their families, their extended tribal families, to resettle in the land of Goshen in Egypt, where they survived not just this one famine, but for about 4 centuries there in the delta of Egypt. Until, of course, new fearful Egyptian rulers came into power and then made them all slaves. And you know what happened then. So even in this short arc of about 4 generations, long generations, right? And we're talking like long lifespans. Even in the span of 4 generations, we see how lies and a lack of integrity sowed all sorts of havoc, usually due to a parent's fear. You know, I've shared before with you how worried as a father I was as Eli was growing up with autism. And Eli's doing pretty darn well now. He's taking college classes. He needs some help. He's adopted this lovely nickname for Laura, which is she who must be obeyed. So that's why he gets his homework done. But I remember so worried about him when I'd go to a preschool performance and see all the kids looking at their parents and singing, and him climbing under the bleachers. And I remember all sorts of heartbreak, not for his sake, he was quite happy, but for mine. I remember praying outside his door on the carpet of the hallway, wrapped up like a kid in the fetal position, praying that my son would be okay, that my heart would be okay. Sometimes I would fall asleep outside the door on the carpet, and Laura would come get me. Are you okay? That was all a parent's fear. When my worry overtook me, I almost drove away my older son because I was so worried that how he would turn out. Fortunately, Jeremy and I have grown through that kind of anxiety and fearfulness on my part. Still think Jeremy could be a little more fearful himself, might be useful, but but the important thing is that we love each other a lot, have forgiven each other many times over. And I don't think I'm the only one in this room who, as a parent, has ever been afraid for their child or children. In fact, I think that a little bit of fear is part of fathering, and in fact, part of parenting. The problem with fear is, though, that too much fear can tempt a person to take shortcuts. I mean, it happens all the time. It happens at work. It happens in government. It happens in politics. I mean, oh my gosh. You get enough people scared about something, whether it's really that real or not, and they'll pull the lever for your team. Right? Too much fear can tempt a person to take shortcuts in how intelligently we view the world. In other words, do we look at the world with wisdom or with fear and simplicity? Do we look at the world honorably? Do we behave in the world with integrity? And do we confidently place our trust in someone or something that is trustworthy? Or do we withhold our faith from the people, from the God who is worth it? So yeah, today's topic is how not to be a fearful dad. And I wanted to tell you another story. Not a story as recent as fearful Ken McKnight, the anxious arachnophobe, or the ancient stories of those first biblical patriarchs. I wanted to tell you another story. It's a true story about a man named Dick Yeager, and it's told by one of his sons, Isaac. In 1901, a former slave named Isaac Johnson published a book about his life. You can find it. It's at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill website. He'd been raised by what he remembered as a loving father who was white and a loving mother who was black back in pre-Civil War 1800s. So I'm going to read you some of this. I'm going to read this to you and ask you to give me the patience it'll take to listen. This is a first-hand account. I will concede I did a little bit of editing so it would hold together, and I changed a few of the words to make them more easily understood. But it's by and large his writing in 1901. Isaac writes this: I was born in the state of Kentucky in 1844. When I first came to a knowledge of myself, I was a child living with my parents on a farm located on the banks of the Green River. The family at that time consisted of my father, Richard Yeager, my mother, Jane, 3 brothers, and I. Here we lived a happy and contented family life, and prosperous beyond most of the farmers in that section of the state. Jane was a slave, captured from Madagascar by my grandfather and his brothers and bequeathed to him at his father's death. My father took Jane and moved on to a farm on Green River. He used Jane in all respects as a wife, and she, in her innocence, imagined that she was. I well remember their little house. It was 20 by 16. Is that a whole lot bigger than our stage here, maybe? 20 by 16 with a 9-foot ceiling. It had only one outside door and 2 windows. The house was divided into 2 rooms, a kitchen and a bedroom. Their furniture and their cooking utensils were limited but sufficient for our wants, and on the whole, it was a happy home. They at first had no neighbors closer than 10 miles. They worked together in harmony, the family did, with my mom taking the lead in the house and my dad in the field, where she often assisted him. The first year they raised such vegetables as they needed, but these brought no money. Then they commenced raising tobacco. Well, we all know what happens then, right? Their first crop of tobacco brought them $1,600 in cash, $55,000 today. They were so encouraged by that they devoted now all their energy to this product, and in time they became the leading tobacco growers in the area. Other people soon came around them as neighbors. None of them owned slaves. The newcomers disapproved and freely talked about my father and his manner of living with a slave and raising children by her. This talk resulted in our social ostracism, despite that we were more prosperous than any of those families. Yeager, my father, felt that insult very keenly and concluded to sell out and leave that part of the country. So he advertised our farm and our livestock for sale. The sale took place, and he sent the horses to the New Orleans market, leaving us family back at the house to wait for him. We remained at home waiting for him to come back. But about 2 months thereafter, suddenly the county sheriff came one day and took us all to Bardstown in Nelson County, about 2 days' journey eastward. And there we were placed in the Negro pen for the night. The next morning, to our astonishment, a crowd gathered and took turns examining everyone in our family. What it all meant, we could not imagine until my little brother Louis was let out about 10 o'clock, placed on the auction block, and the auctioneer cried out, "How much do I hear for this N-word?" Allow me to say here, it was only the vulgar and the low whites who used the N-word. The higher class people always spoke of us as Negroes or colored folks. The auctioneer continued his cry for bids, and Louis was at last sold for $800, $27,000 in today's dollars. By this time, we finally understood the situation, it seemed as though my mother's heart was going to break. Such despair I hope I may never witness again. We children knew that something terrible was being done, but weren't old enough to fully understand. Then the auctioneer called for me, and I was let out. And he said, "Time is precious, gentlemen. I must sell all of them by midnight, by tonight. How much do I hear for this N-word?" The first bid was $400. It was gradually raised until I was struck off for $700 to William Mattingly, who came forward and said to me, "Come along, boy. You belong to me now." I said to him, "Let me go and see my mother." He answered me crossly, "I'll train you without your mother's help." I was taken to one side and chained to a post, as though I was a horse. I remained hitched at this post till late in the afternoon, while the rest of my family was sold into slavery, each one separately. Thus, in a very short time, our happy family was scattered without even the privilege of saying goodbye to each other, and never to see them again, at least as far as I knew. Late in the afternoon, my new master put me into a wagon and took me over some very rough and hilly roads to his family home 5 miles away on a farm on the Beech Fork River. We got there at about 10 p.m. His wife, their one child, and Peter, a slave they already had, constituted his family, and I made one more. Upon reaching the place, Mattingly called loudly, introducing me to his wife. This is one of the Jaeger N-words we saw advertised for sale at auction. She said, I declare he's not a very dark-colored one. No, wife, he isn't, but he's one of those blankety-blank N-words from the mountains. Oh, Bill, what makes you talk that way? I think he will make a good servant. His reply was, I reckon he will when he gets this black whip wrapped around him a couple of times. William, I hope he will not need that at all. I don't think he's as stupid as Peter. Oh, well, Margaret, I don't mind if he's stupid. I can train him. There's nothing like the black snake, what he called the whip, for stupidness. I had never heard such talk before, and I hung my head and began to sob when she said, oh, Bill, don't scare the boy to death. I think he will be good. She brought a lamp from the shelf and carefully looked me over, after which she said, what a nice young man. What a nice suit he has on. Oh, yeah, wife. Up on the mountains, they don't know how to work the N-words, but I will teach him how to work. The idea of an N-word with a suit on him like that, wait till I get a suit on him, I'll show him how to work. She then asked, what's your name? I said, Isaac. That's a nice little name, she said. Take off your hat, put it on the chair, and come sit down in the corner. I took off my hat and coat and looked for a place to hang them, as I had been accustomed to in our old home, but found none. So I laid them in a little bundle and walked over to the corner of the fireplace and sat on the floor. I sat there for hours thinking of my mother, my brothers, and my father, until I nearly went wild thinking about the terrible change that had come over me, from a happy home to one where I was treated like a dog, and a pretty mean one at that. I wondered whether I would ever see my family again. And then he ends this way, this chapter anyway. I little dreamed what I would afterward come to learn, that my own father had brought all this upon us, that we were sold by his orders, and the $3,300 we were sold for, about $110,000 today, went into his pockets, less expenses of the sale. He had sold his own flesh and blood. The truth can be a very, very bitter pill. But Jesus told us that it can set us free, even the truth about the people we want to idolize. Even the truth about our own moms and dads, the truth about our own heroes, the truth about our own pastors or presidents. Jesus said to the people who believed in him, you are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You know, speaking of idolizing, I have to imagine, what sort of idol did that man bow down to that he would sell his own wife and children? Common law wife, but still so. You know, we're all tempted to bow down to idols, whether because we're afraid of real life and we find false ones that will reassure us, or because we're selfish and have low integrity. I mean, it's happened ever since the first generation, the second generation of Christians, right? When the Judaizers who wanted to insist that all the new Christians had to become circumcised before they could follow Jesus, as if the teachings of Jesus weren't enough. And nowadays, we dads, we do idolize things. God forbid anything that horrific, but we idolize. We put the idol of career ahead of our family. We put the idol of financial gain ahead of our integrity. And we put the idol of an easy story ahead of the hard truth of real facts. I'm assuming Mr. Jaeger didn't sell his family into slavery out of Christian conviction, although many, many Christians rationalize slavery by cherry-picking Bible verses. No, I'm guessing his abandonment and treachery came from a far more basic place, and that place is fear. Fear of being ridiculed or ostracized by the whites in his family and neighborhood. Fear of missing out now that he learned he could make a lot of money in this new system, this new tobacco crop. Or was it the Achilles heel that a lot of us men have, the fear of responsibility when things get serious? You know, in fact, we live in a society that seems to value freedom to the max, don't we? I mean, July 4th is coming up. A lot of us, including myself, we've got shirts with U.S. flags on, and somewhere on that it says freedom. But I've yet to see a picture of the U.S. flag flying and the word responsibility. But Paul said this about responsibility. For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters, but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command, this command of Jesus: love your neighbor as yourself. Are there any Janis Joplin fans here? All right, so then you'll get this. Freedom's just another word for... All right, we won't break into song, but yeah, that was Janis Joplin. Jesus said something different. Freedom's just the ability to choose an effective way to love, an effective way to be responsible. So choosing responsibility over freedom, to choose fearless self-sacrifice over self-indulgence, that's what honorable Christ followers do. That's what grown-ups in general should do, especially parents and fathers. Now, today is Father's Day. I'm going to wind up by just reminding you that there's another holiday that we're also celebrating. Does anybody know what day this is? Yeah. Good for us. I didn't know about this day probably 5 years ago. Juneteenth. You know, the date when the slaves in Galveston, Texas finally heard that they were free. 2.5 years after Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a number of reasons people give about why it had taken so long for that to happen. One of the stories goes that the messenger who was sent to tell them was killed on the way. They didn't want anybody to tell the slaves they were free. Another was that they wanted, the slave owners wanted to get one more harvest out of the crops before they told the slaves. And the other was mostly what reality is they didn't think they had to because they were in charge. But for fathers, for mothers, for parents, and for all of us, remember James said it is a sin to know what you ought to do and then not to do it. Friends, it's far easier to become a father of children than it is to be a father to children. And for the dads in this room, I know you're not perfect. I can speak from experience that it's hard to be even successful as a dad, let alone perfect. But I'm going to invite you on a way that isn't the way of Dick Yeager, that betrays your family and your children and your wife because some other road has come along, some easier idol. And this way is these: to view the world with wisdom, humility and curiosity, and not ideology or fear. When your child surprises you with something painful to hear, be curious before you're angry. Number 2, behave with integrity in your family and in the world. Less self-centeredness, more self-sacrifice, and no lies. And finally, number 3, give your mind and your family the gift of peace by trusting that God will never abandon you. That is ultimately the promise that God gave to Abraham in that first generation. That is ultimately the promise that God made to you at your baptism. That is finally the promise he gives to all those who decide that they are going to trust Jesus enough to make him the Lord of their life. A lot of you have rocky backgrounds with your dad. And I think of the background or think of the expression, you know what? You just need to accept Jesus into your heart. And my response to that is, yeah. But you also need to accept that Jesus has already accepted you into his heart. That's the heart of the Father that he came here to teach and show. And dads, that's the heart I pray that all of us can learn together to show our children as they grow. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for the blessing it is to be dads. We thank you, Lord, whether we're biological or adoptive or foster or just kind of vicarious fathers, Lord, whether we're coaches and teachers, whether we're Cub Scout leaders, whether we're stepdads and any sort of relationship, Lord, to young people who look up to us. Help us be worthy of their faith. Help us be wise. Help us live with integrity. Help us show them that our way is your way, so that they will not feel lost. They will not be abandoned. And Lord, they'll know that they're deeply, deeply loved by their Father on earth and their Father in heaven. Lord, keep us far from fear and lead us deep into faith. In your name we pray. Amen.